way. What we do know is that in December of 1943, so we're more than half a year after the destruction of the ghetto, we know that Emanuel Ringelblum, who was the great chronicler of the life and death in the ghetto, who was the initiator of the Oneg Shabbat archive, he wrote a note to Adolf Berman, whose name we have heard, of the Poalei Zion, and he writes, and this is a quote, "And why is there no information on the Zhezhevu in the history of what happened in the ghetto? They must leave an imprint, even if our eyes they are unsympathetic," unquote. And it's very important to note the stress on the fact that even if in our eyes they are unsympathetic, because that gives you some idea of what the ambiance was like and the rivalry between these different political movements. To our ears it sounds strange and even perverse that these rivalries persisted when this remnant of the Jewish population is on the verge of destruction. They've seen so many terrible things happen. But unfortunately this has been something that's been a traditional Jewish problem, this high level of politicization. I venture to say very little has changed since then, and we haven't learned a great deal since then. But it is important that Ringelblum, before the destruction of the ghetto, did visit the headquarters of the Zhezhevu, and he left a very detailed account, and he was very impressed by what he saw, that the fighters were very well armed. He witnessed a transaction between the leadership of this underground organization and a Polish officer who was selling them a lot of weapons for what was then big money, and he recorded that. And so we do know, even from a source that we can say is maybe not completely objective, but on the contrary would not exaggerate, that this was a potent force, at least relative to the circumstances that existed. Now, one of the problems that we have in today in reconstructing the story is that, one, as I've mentioned, very few people survived. The people who did survive were not people in the leadership category. They were basically simple fighters, and so they themselves were not necessarily privy to everything that had been going on. We are talking about an underground organization, which means detailed records were not kept. This isn't the U.S. Army, which is recording every move. So there's much that we don't know, and there's much that I venture to say we may never know. But the other important aspect is that politicization that I mentioned. Already toward the end of the war, but even before the war had ended, there was already an emphasis being placed on how this story of the Warsaw Ghetto was going to be transmitted. Okay, and already, and we're talking about 1944, there was jockeying among the different political parties or the political factions whose youth had fought in the Uprising for credit. So you have a rivalry between the Bund and the Zionist youth movements. Who was the one that deserved the most credit for the Warsaw Ghetto? Who did the lion's share of the fighting? And in that calculus, the Zhezhevu was rather left out. Another reason why it also sort of fell by the wayside, at least in terms of telling the story, the revisionists in the ghetto, these Betarim, believed that they were in contact with Poles who were in the mainstream Polish underground, what's called the Home Army or the Armia Krajowa. As it happens, they were in contact with Poles, but they were not in contact with the people who were from the official mainstream underground. They were in contact with this very sort of shadowy renegade group, which didn't really keep documents, and even had they done so, they would have been of very questionable reliability. So the mainstream Polish underground was in touch actually with the mainstream organization, and therefore much of what we know which came from that documentation simply doesn't exist. And that problem was also compounded once the State of Israel was established, because it was largely left to institutions that were connected with particular political parties to tell the story. Okay, and the revisionist movement, the precursors of the Likud or Herut, were very slow in establishing institutions that would be devoted to telling the story. Menachem Begin himself was also not in the forefront of transmitting that knowledge for a number of reasons. One, he himself hadn't been there, and I suspect, and I'm not one who is given to complex psychological explanations, but it probably did have something to do with it. He also had some mixed emotions. But also, Begin himself at that time was very busy in trying to ensure that the Etzel would be enshrined in the pantheon of heroes who had liberated the country from the British and from the Arabs. And that was a whole nother struggle, which took many years to succeed in. And so this was not really on the top of his agenda. There's another thing that makes this story even more complicated and I would say required a lot of detective work in order to make it known, and that is at the very beginning of the 1960s, when there was within the revisionist group or the revisionist family, they call it the Mishpacha Lochemet, the idea, basically it was the quest of a couple, Chaim and Chaya Lazar, two very dedicated people who I happily, at least Chaya happily had the opportunity of meeting before she passed away, and was a very inspiring figure. They devoted a good part of their lives to saying, listen, we have to correct this wrong. We have to do what we can to see that information is accumulated and that this story be told. But unfortunately, they got involved in a group of Poles, very shadowy group in Warsaw, of people who claimed for themselves the honor of having been the sort of patrons of the revisionist underground, and they said we were the ones who were providing them with weapons, we were the ones who assisted them, and the Lazars were ready to believe that, partly because one of their interlocutors in Warsaw was a particularly engaging and very persuasive man, and over time, not only they were sucked into this, but many other reputable journalists and historians who came to Warsaw and met this group, but in particular one man whose name was Henryk Iwański. He is honored in Yad Vashem as a righteous among the nations, though between us, I imagine at some point there will be some reconsideration of whether he really deserved that title. But he put himself forward and said, listen, I'm the guy who devoted his life to this. He said that he had been himself wounded, that he'd lost his own brother and two sons in the struggle to assist the insurgents. And this was an inspiring story told by a man who evidently had great qualities of a thespian, and people were prepared to believe it. And strangely enough, this became part of the sort of canonical version of this organization. So much so that this name, Henryk Iwański, can be found in many encyclopedias. As I said, his name is enshrined in Yad Vashem and in many other places. And slowly, over time, we began to have certain doubts about the validity of this story, and at the end of the day, we discover not only did this guy not lose his two sons and his brother, he didn't have any sons. He only had a daughter. There were no sons in the picture. But this was something that was reported on in all the media and in the press, and I could just name it in the Jerusalem Post. There were several stories. And also the man put himself forward as being a victim of communist oppression, kind of a poor guy, very unfortunate, needy, wounded. And Jews have a big heart. And when Jews saw this, people would come and visit. Of course, the first thing they wanted to do was to ensure that he would receive a pension from the joint, and certain monies were transferred. But we discovered today that that story is basically a fake. Now, also, these Poles put forth a name of somebody whom they claimed was the most important figure in the underground, someone by the name of David Apfelbaum. And they came together and said, listen, if you want to tell the story of the Jewish underground, the revisionist Jewish underground, it was David Apfelbaum who was the initiator of this. He was a veteran of the Polish army. He had been an officer, and he was the one who got this group together and trained them and got the weapons. And that name also is enshrined in many places. I personally met on a number of occasions the former president of, the late president of Poland, Lech Kaczynski, who was killed in a terrible airplane accident. Well, when he was the mayor of Warsaw, he initiated a plan to name a square in the city after this Apfelbaum. Now, we did a little bit of checking, and we discovered that no such person ever even existed. There was no David Apfelbaum, and we can say that with some degree of certainty. And the fact that we published this information already in 2007, and not one person was able to emerge from the Jewish community any place in the world and say, guys, very nice that you've come up with this theory, but here was David Apfelbaum. The guy simply didn't exist. But there's a street named after him for Warsaw. If you visit the grounds of the Warsaw Ghetto, you'll see a memorial tablet with his name engraved in it. So this is just, and by the way, I always tell students that if you want to know what the state of popular knowledge is, the best thing you want to do is look at Wikipedia, because that's the only thing today, I hate to say it, that's the only thing that counts among young people. If you talk to young people and say, I want you to produce a paper on this or that subject, well, I can assure you the first thing, and maybe the only thing they will do is run home and look at Wikipedia. And until very recently, all of this was on Wikipedia without any suggestion that it might not have been accurate. Now, further compounding this story and making it more complex, and I say this with a heavy heart, unfortunately, Poles do not have a monopoly on playing games with the truth. And there are a number of memoirs, first-hand accounts by Jews who presented themselves as having been fighters, which we now know are either greatly exaggerated or simply fake. And I can give you one particular example, which was personally very disturbing to me. There's one account written by a survivor in New Jersey who's passed away.